The Atlanta Story is a podcast highlighting Atlanta's most interesting creators, entrepreneurs, and builders. I'm JC Cadet with Atlanta Ventures and co-producer alongside John Birdsong. In today's episode, John sits down with Conor Sen, a regular columnist for Bloomberg. Conor moved to Atlanta from California in 2010 and has documented several trends and market shifts through his popular Twitter account @ConorSen. Conor parlayed his popularity into a weekly column for Bloomberg, where his thoughts on housing, economics, and technology can be read each week. In today's interview, we get to escape the paywall and hear Conor's take on the current housing market, economy, trends in Atlanta, what he does when he's not writing, and much more. We hope you enjoy the show and subscribe to The Atlanta Story. Conor Sen, welcome to the Atlanta Story podcast. Thank you for being here.
John, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Atlanta United fan, writer. We've got so much to talk about today. Bloomberg columnist and very ardent fan of Atlanta and what's been going on. Fan of the Sun Belt. So let's start with a few things. But first, 6 years writing for Bloomberg. Here's a Southern writer, right? Can I call you a Southern writer now?
At this point, yeah.
At this point.
Adopted South, yeah.
Adopted South, right? Harvey Mudd College. Mm-hmm. And then how'd you make your way to Atlanta?
So I feel like I have to start at the beginning, and this will help inform the discussion. So I was born in Maryland. My dad was in the Navy. He was stationed there. And my parents are from Boston originally. So when his service time was up after fourth grade for me, our family moved back to Boston. Okay. And so for them, they thought as going home, going back to family. Whereas for me, it was going somewhere new that I hadn't been before. So when I moved there, it's sort of they talked funny. They rooted for different sports teams. And at some point pretty early on, I'm like, this isn't home. I live here, but this is not my place.
Yep.
And I think that helped shape my decisions going forward. So that, to your point,
that's why you are not a New England fan.
No,
or
don't have an accent.
Patriots.
Right, exactly. So I went out to California for college. I graduated high school in 1999, so that was kind of peak.com.
Yep.
And I wanted to go into computer science, so I figured why not just go to California, do that. I was out there for 10 years, kind of after the bust, I moved into finance. And after the 2008 crash, working for a hedge fund in San Francisco, I sort of thought, okay, I need to get away from this. I felt like my time on the West Coast was over.
Yep. And when you say get away from this, just the culture,
Yeah, I just felt like sort of too many emotional scars from being out there.
Got
the breakup and
yes,
work stuff, the crash, just like, all right, I need to get away from here. Probably a lot of people wanted to get away from whatever they were doing in 2008, 2009.
Yes.
So I didn't know where I wanted to go. I actually bought a one-way plane ticket to Austin, Texas, and I planned on moving there. But then before I did that, I decided I wanted to tour around the Southeast. Had never really been to this part of the country. I had a friend who I'd worked with in San Francisco who had come back to Atlanta, and also a friend in San Francisco who was from Atlanta. And so I came out here, used their network, kind of drove around, and kind of felt like this feels like home. I don't have a job here, don't have any reason to be here, but this place feels like home.
And that was 2010. Yes.
And so I moved here without a job, without really knowing a whole lot of people.
But you got on Twitter.
I got on Twitter.
That's kind of where we first met, probably 13 years ago on Twitter.
Yeah. And it was, I looked at my job as my job is to learn Atlanta, meet people, and just figure it out.
Yes. And so that was 2010, and did a stint at Cabbage for a year or two. But talk to us about just kind of your desire and interest in, let's just call it macroeconomics, and then tying it into microeconomics, and then really housing piece. Like where did that sort of love for that specific niche?
Yeah. So I would say the only time I've ever gotten caught by a bubble bursting was in college, where I went out to California, majored in computer science. Freshman year, all these great startups were coming on campus to recruit. They were giving away free DVD players, which was a big deal at the time, and PlayStations, lots and lots of startups. You felt like, all right, I'm going to crush it when I get out of here. And then the bubble bursts. And a year later, especially after 9/11, there's nobody. It's Microsoft and defense companies were the only people recruiting on campus. And it was like, what just happened to my plans? And so that got me interested in economics to try to figure out, okay, why did my world fall apart? And so that was kind of the early seed being planted to learn about that and interest rate cuts. And then also Harvey Mudd is It's in greater Los Angeles, but it's really closer to the Inland Empire, San Bernardino County, Riverside County. So even out there, you'd see like the subprime stuff started out there in 2003.
Right.
You had people who had bought houses for 200, 250. Like, I just made $100,000 in my house in 6 months. It's like, this is just like tract sprawl land. There's nothing out here. What's going on? So it's sort of
and you were observing that, reading it. What were you?
Yeah.
How'd you pick it up?
I mean, you just go to like the mall, which was Ontario Mills was the mall 15 minutes away. You'd see housing developments going up, just building everywhere, prices going up on houses. You just kind of feel the energy.
Yeah.
And so, being out there sort of experiencing the dot-com bubble bursting, you could see the subprime thing happening. And you're just like, oh, this is interesting. Let's try to figure out what's going on here.
And that was 2005, 2006 that you started to see that, or?
Yeah. So I'm 2003 was when I graduated college.
Yeah.
But then moving up to the Bay Area in San Jose, I worked for eBay for a year.
Okay.
And so you could see townhomes being built, and the price would seemingly go up every 3 or 6 months. And you could just, again, feel the housing energy. And then going to work for the hedge fund, that, of course, in 2006, 2007 was like the big question of what is this? This is shutting down. How big a problem is this going to be? And so maybe to some extent, I just kind of got lucky. I don't know if lucky is the right word, but just all these interesting things were happening around me, and I was trying to figure out what was going on.
And were you documenting things personally at that time, or writing about it in some way, shape, or form? Obviously not on Bloomberg.
Right. That's when I kind of got into blogs, because at that point, the mainstream media wasn't covering this stuff very well. Credit default swaps and subprime stuff going on in Florida. And so blogs, you could get kind of people on the ground saying like, I'm seeing this crazy stuff. And that's kind of where like a lot of the bearish blogs came to be of like, this is all going to crash. And you're like, wow. And you're so young too. So you don't really have any perspective here. You're just like, this is incredible. This is going to be like the end of the world. I'm going to move to a farm and buy gold. And, so seeing that play out, kind of, you could see, okay, there was a lot of stuff that went wrong here, but you also saw the government stepped in, and it was really bad for a long time, but we got through it. We're still standing today.
Barely.
But it was like, okay, you sort of saw how complex the world is, and maybe you don't have all the things figured out when you're 25, 26.
So you go through that, and a lot of us listening went through that transformational time period, and you moved to Atlanta. You're like, all right, refresh, restart. How did you decide what you wanted to do next?
So I think 2010 was a great time because I was starting over at 29, and I feel like Atlanta as a city was kind of starting over
so true.
at that period of time too.
So, I mean, 5 years away from Pond City Market.
Right. City Hall East was still there. I lived in the Highlands at the time.
Yep.
There was just a hole in the ground where Buckhead, Atlanta now is. I remember when, I think we connected over Avalon, actually, when I wrote a column saying Avalon's going to be a thing, and for the creative loafing. And so all these in-town people are like, oh, the burbs, Alpharetta, screw that. And
Mark Toro is doing just fine on that.
Yeah. And even though I was definitely much an ITP person at that point, you're like, all right, I see how this could be interesting. You've got a Whole Foods and drive-to walkability, but it's still cooler than a mall.
It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so at that, I think after...
I do remember that piece.
During Cabbage, I was on Twitter, and I got on Twitter initially just to kind of keep up with the hedge fund stuff of, even though I'm in Atlanta, just keep up on that world. And that I kind of got...
When people think hedge fund, they immediately think just billionaire hedge fund. Can you talk about what your perspective of a hedge fund is? Yeah,
so I got really lucky there. I was... Post eBay, I applied on monster.com to this hedge fund job, and I never thought I would hear back because it's like, come on. Monster.com, right? It's only kind of shady fly-by-night companies. And I got a call. I'm like, okay. And, they say, we want to interview you. I say, great. So I drive up to San Francisco because I'm living in San Jose at the time. And it's at 1 Market Street, which is the very end of Market Street, overlooking the Ferry Building. They had the entire 22nd floor, whole view of the bay and Alcatraz and the whole thing.
Yeah, billions.
Yeah.
Truly billions.
It was truly that multi-billion-dollar hedge fund run by like a guy who's a big deal. And super intimidated because I've never been in any kind of environment like that.
Yes.
But they brought me on, and I was kind of really kind of starstruck at just the world I found myself in.
What did they see in your monster.com resume and application?
So the job was for quantitative risk management.
Okay.
And I think the fact that I had the strong tech background from Harvey Mudd, I was very interested in finance, and I was kind of self-taught and could at least talk my way through an interview. And then also, I think it was sort of like we've seen all like the Goldman Sachs guys and they all kind of think alike and sound alike. And you're smarter, but you're not as polished. And
Right.
that's interesting to us. And we'll just take you on and see how this goes.
Got it. And so during that time, what chops did you learn?
So they sat me down on the trading desk because I wasn't sort of formally trained the way a lot of other analysts would have
Right.
been. And they were like, just kind of sit here and absorb things and help out. I had a daily risk report I had to run. That was the main thing that I had to do. Our prior risk manager was moving to Singapore to be closer to his family. So I was working with him to manage this risk report, but then it was just answer the phone, help out, sort of do things. And that's actually kind of where I got involved with the subprime credit stuff, where one of our analysts went to New York, went to a conference, came back. This was in late 2006. And was like, I don't understand this stuff very well, but it seems like a big deal. And they were just like, all right, Conor, try to see what you can figure out here.
Got it. And so let's jump back to Atlanta 2010, because it was a very interesting time. A lot of things were in motion, right? I mean, kind of new mayor at the time. How did the Bloomberg opportunity come about? And how are you able to, let's just start with that question.
Yeah. So this is where Twitter really was everything, because I was, living in Atlanta where until I joined Cabbage 6 months later, didn't have a whole lot going on. So I would be on Twitter a lot. I met people in Atlanta through Twitter. And
do you think you can still do that today?
Yes, for sure. It would be different. It would be harder, but for sure. You wouldn't. I think that back then you were lucky because a lot of very prominent people now were very small scale then. So you could get to know them before they were big deals.
Right.
But you could certainly still find a community and people that way.
Yeah. So Twitter led you to... So you were tweeting,
right.
you were tweeting a bunch, yeah.
And people would follow you, you would talk to them, meet up with people, and then you'd get connected with reporters and other people in the industry. And kind of like the way we're talking now, you just build a relationship and people think you have something to say. And eventually one of these guys went to work for Bloomberg and they were looking for columnists and he suggested me.
So can we dissect some of the most interesting pieces in the last, let's just call it 2 months? And I know we were talking about this before, but your pieces are fascinating, right? They're not breaking news. There's probably a shelf life on them, right? But when historians look back at, this time period in economics, this is a pretty good digestion of what's going on with a wide range of things.
I think so. That what I try to do is find a bigger picture theme or trend, but sort of very timely information that relates to that trend to sort of prove it out. So here's a trend that you might not believe in, but here are 2 or 3 things happening now that support that. And it's like, okay, well, these things are clearly happening. And yeah, maybe I can get there or move in that direction, that kind of thing.
And is that the broader framework you use for your pieces?
I would say in general, right? So things like moving to the Sun Belt, remote work.
That's in your Twitter bio.
Markets.
Fan of the Sun Belt.
Yes.
So why is that?
So I think historically in the late 20th century, people moved to Atlanta, metros like Atlanta, Phoenix, Dallas. And it was kind of people from the North working ordinary jobs who were just moving down here for the weather and low taxes. And they were doing anything, manager of a store. I don't want to say nothing special, but the sort of top tier knowledge jobs weren't coming here. It was really everybody else. And I think with the growth of the internet, smartphones, cloud computing, we now have access to those types of jobs and opportunities in ways we didn't even, I would say, 10 or 15 years ago.
This podcast is brought to you by Atlanta Ventures. Check out our website to access many resources, including free tools and guides to start a business, a calendar of our upcoming events hosted at Atlanta Tech Village, and a lot more content around building companies. Computers, everything's at our fingertips. The pandemic probably pushed a lot of the knowledge workers, traditional knowledge workers, to the South. But let's dive in on that thread of, okay, well, the Sun Belt is something that you are very bullish on.
Well, I would say that, and I think this is also where we were connecting about a decade or so ago. that we both saw the potential that Atlanta had at the time.
Yes.
And yet in the early 2010s, it was a struggle to get people from New York, California to consider Atlanta for those types of jobs, those types of people. And we were saying Fortune 500 companies, airport, MARTA, Georgia Tech. We would really kind of try to create this economic development blueprint on the facts, but the vibes weren't there yet for us yet.
Right.
It was like, well, Atlanta, I don't know, Deep South, whatever. And now Atlanta's so trendy that you don't need the blueprint anymore. Everyone gets it already. So it's almost like a startup where your seed round, your Series A round, you're really hustling hard. But once you have that traction, your Series C, Series D, it's like, we're backed by these companies. We've got we're a unicorn. Like, you got to be in.
Yeah.
And it just shows how, as you grow, it becomes an easier and easier sell.
It's interesting you say that. So I went to middle school with a pal who had moved out to LA in middle school, and 2 weeks ago was the first time in 20 something years he'd come back to Atlanta. And when you say you just kind of get it, he and I caught up for a drink, and he was like, I can't, I'm shocked at what is happened here. Like, again, middle school, so you don't really, you got your little bubble, but he's like, everything from, Midtown, Ponce City, Old Fourth Ward, and he's setting up vet clinics as well. So there's demographics and
I would say I couldn't have moved here in 2005, and I moved here in 2010. You really needed the 5 years of social media, even Google Chat, text, smartphones, Yelp, all that to be there for me to have been able to move here and do what I like to do.
Let's talk about housing, and particularly in Atlanta, a little bit more micro economics, but let's just go from 2010 to today, what you've seen in terms of evolution.
I remember in 2010, there was a point in 2010 or 2011 where I was like, I should probably buy a place, like maybe a condo in Midtown, something like that. And I had friends who I had met through church, and they're like, you can't buy in Midtown. It's like condos it's only 30% occupied. It's still kind of unsafe. So even at that point, people were like, you can't buy in Midtown. That was the conventional wisdom. Whereas today it's like, can you find anything built in the past 20 years for under $500,000? Probably not.
Right.
So we look back at it now, but that was really the time when people were talking about renting society. There was Groupon living social. It was really this, you don't want to own stuff, you just want to rent. And especially if you were our age, where we had seen people lose all their shirts in the housing market. And we were like, I'm never going to do that. And I think most 25-year-olds never think about home ownership in general. So it was just fascinating to go from that to now where it's like people who, maybe lived around the Beltline are now willing to buy a home in Johns Creek or Suwannee, where you're like, what, out there? It just shows how much things have changed in really just a decade.
There are a lot of people moving, and I think it was probably pandemic induced as well, right? Of if we're going to be remote, then what do I want to prioritize, sacrifice? And Johns Creek's a great example, up in Avalon and Alpharetta, even higher ball ground.
Right. I mean, I think in general, like 10 years ago, Monday Night Brewing had just started up, and craft beer was still kind of a new edgy thing for Intown Atlanta.
Yes.
And now they've got breweries in Forsyth County.
Right.
So even the consumer amenities that we were just getting in town 10 years ago now are everywhere. So that becomes an easier sell as well. It's like, do people really want about walkability, or do they want just good food and things to do?
Yeah.
And that's where the suburbs can offer something that they couldn't 10 years ago.
Well, and to that point, I was talking with a buddy yesterday who said he lives in Inman Park. He's like, within 500 yards, I've got 20 restaurants and then within a mile radius, I've got 45. That's what he is prioritizing, right? But then let's go one step further. What about places like Macon, Athens, Columbus, right? How do you see those trends of kind of demographic shifts and people moving to those places?
So I wrote a column saying that I think southern college towns are interesting in the remote work world, where maybe you went to UGA and you had a great time there, but you're like, well, I can't find a job here in my 20s. What am I going to do? But now maybe you're going to live in Atlanta for a while, get a career established here. But when you're 30 or 35, you can take your job to Athens with you and buy a house and have access to all of that, but also have a remote work job. And maybe you're going into Atlanta every once in a while. So I think that's an opportunity for sort of your college towns. Macon and Columbus are interesting because they have a lot of the bones of urbanism. Downtown Macon's actually gotten a lot better in recent years. I don't know if you've been lately. But I think the question is there a talent critical mass to really get that going, or will it just kind of be your downtown's cool and interesting, but the surrounding metro is still just struggling to hit that escape velocity?
Yeah. Do you think a lot of the escape velocity for towns like that have been prioritized or highlighted because of the pandemic, right? I mean, just talking to a buddy the other day, lived in downtown Chicago for 15 years, pandemic hit, moved 300 miles south just across the Mississippi. He's got a condo, looks over the Mississippi. He's like, I thought I was going to just, hang out here for a year, and I'm staying here. Do you see that happening even more in the macro trends of, let's just call it Georgia, right? I mean, are you seeing that sort of?
I think it'll be yes to, but it's sort of a question of what places are viable and what aren't. And we'll probably see like Athens will work really well. I think Blue Ridge in North Georgia for a certain kind of person will work well as like a low-cost Tahoe, so to speak. Yeah. Maybe it's an exaggeration, but I think you kind of see what I'm saying.
That's a good Twitter quip.
And I think the question will be for a Macon or a Columbus, where does that fall on the, does this work or not? And to me, that's an unanswered question. It might be yes, but I think it's too soon to tell.
Yeah. Back to a couple fun, a couple fun topics that you've recently written about. The housing market doesn't need much for buyers to return.
So this has been interesting because we're doing this in early February, and in December, mortgage rates had fallen from a peak of over 7 in October, which totally shut down the housing market, to at that point they had gotten down to like 6.5. And you would see like there was a little bit of a spike in mortgage purchase applications. So there was a little bit more interest, but December is a typically slow time for the housing market in general. You weren't sure, does this mean anything? So early January was really going to be a big tell. And we get to January and mortgage rates creep down a little bit more. And all of a sudden, all the anecdotes from brokers and realtors are like, things are hopping. And it looks like January might have been the best month for new home sales in over a year. And I think what happened was when mortgage rates hit 5 last spring, and then especially 6 and 7, a lot of people who wanted to buy a home were like, I'm just out. And I'll wait until January and see where things are. And those people, January hit, maybe they've got a kid, maybe they're just like, it's just time, I have to do this.
And they get that 6.5%.
6.5% mortgage, prices have come down a little bit. They still have their jobs, and they're like, I just need to do this. And we're seeing that even mortgage rates in the low sixes lead to probably a balanced housing market where I don't think home prices are going down anymore, which is something that I don't think people would have believed even 2 months ago.
But it feels crazy because 24 months ago, it was
3. Yeah.
3. Yeah, 2.9, 3.
And affordability is still awful. It's objectively awful in any kind of historical income to monthly payment ratio, things like that. But I've got a view about millennials where my quip is that anything millennials need won't be cheap because it's a big generation. We saw that when people were getting apartments a decade ago, apartments were really expensive. We hadn't built them yet. Now people are getting into their home buying years. Those aren't cheap either. And I think, unfortunately, this is just going to be kind of the story of the millennial generation as it passes through its adult years of there will come a point when the average millennial is, say, 45, where, what do you do financially when you're 45? You save for retirement. You invest in the stock market. And stocks will not be cheap. I guarantee you we're going to have the highest valuations for stocks 10, 15 years from now that we've had since probably the dot-com bubble in the late 90s, because that's when baby boomers were at that age and investing in stocks. So if you're at the point now where you can like beat that millennial rush, you want to do that, because I just guarantee you when those 1990 babies are looking to invest in the market, it's just going to be rough.
Very
the same way the housing market is today.
That makes sense. And so do you feel like, timing in the last 2 years of buying a house or not was people had to get lucky, or, there's kind of a pre-COVID, post-COVID?
For sure. And when we were coming through the job market and things were pretty tough, there was a nostalgic look back at the 1960s and 70s of, these factory workers who had pensions and lifetime employment would have been nice. And I think people younger than us will look back at people who bought homes before 2022 and say, those millennials got 3% mortgages at pre-pandemic pricing. That's so unfair. Like, they were set for life. And to some extent, it's right. But like, that's where we are. And there's nothing you can really do to change that at this point.
So another interesting topic, got a granny, build her a house in your backyard.
Yep.
So let's talk about that.
Accessory dwelling units, otherwise known as ADUs in urbanist terms, I think are an interesting way to address the housing affordability crisis in a less contentious way.
Okay.
Because I'm on the Brookhaven Planning Commission, so I see the people who fight density and any kind of construction really in general. But with ADUs, you can take your house and put in 500, 750 square feet in the backyard, maybe have your aging parents there, maybe have a renter there. And it's not that onerous for the neighborhood. It's a way for you to earn some extra income, maybe have in-laws around, help out with babysitting. And we actually have seen traction in Los Angeles and Seattle as they've relaxed the regulations and sort of promoted this as a housing type. And I think that's something that we could see in Atlanta over the next few years. 500
to 700 square feet. Yeah.
Yeah. So I spoke with a person who does these developments. They haven't done a lot of them, but they are building them in Atlanta. And they will build totally turnkey, 750 square foot, 2-bed ADU for $250,000. And, relative to a single family home or even a townhome, that's just much, much cheaper than that kind of construction.
Yeah. I like it. So one of the other topics that a lot of people are talking about, a recession looks like it suddenly can be avoided.
This has changed a lot, sort of like the housing market, really just in the past 6 weeks. And coming into the year, a lot of people thought a recession was almost inevitable in 2023, maybe even the first half of the year. And we've seen the housing market really turn a corner. I don't want to say it's on fire, but I think relative to where people thought it would be, it's very, very hot all of a sudden. January was the best month for auto sales in about 2 years. And that's because some of the supply chain issues with autos are finally easing up. Social Security, we know that Social Security is adjusted for inflation, but that adjustment only happens once a year. So last year, if you were a retiree, you were just absorbing inflation all year long. And then in January, you were topped up with an 8.5% increase to your Social Security. And nationwide, that turned out to be a $90 billion effect.
Right.
So all of a sudden, it's like a huge stimulus for retirees. And you put all that together, and it looks like January was just a really, really robust month for the economy. And so I think to the extent you were worried about a recession, you should now push that concern off at least towards the latter part of 2023, if not 2024 already.
What's you touched on this a little bit, but what trends are you seeing in just consumer debt?
So it's an interesting thing where debt levels are rising again, delinquency levels are rising again, but they got so low during the pandemic that we're sort of not even back to normal yet on any kind of income adjusted basis or inflation adjusted basis. Credit card debt is still sort of lower on an income adjusted basis than it was pre-pandemic. And the delinquency rates are still below as well. So they're rising. And whenever you hear debt levels are rising, delinquency rates are rising, that sounds concerning. But we're still just on our way back to normal, not even into concerning levels yet.
Are you so on top of the Gen Z trend of the buy now, pay later trend?
I need to see data. So I tend to be generally skeptical of buzzy trends if I don't have the data behind it.
Sure.
So things like great resignation, quiet quitting, I'm like, is this really a thing? Or is this just like somebody wrote something and then we're all talking about the thing that they wrote?
Yeah.
So I'm not close to a lot of Gen Z people, but I'd want to see the data to believe that this is a real thing rather than just someone made up something and now we're all talking about it.
So let's talk about your process. So you've got one article a week. How do you collect the information? What's your writing process? Right? You're pretty prolific.
Yeah, this has taken me a while to kind of figure out like for a while it was just be like, I don't know when we're at next week. I just hope something comes up and I can figure it out. Whereas now there's I have a few trends in mind that I think are mattering at any given time. I also know what the calendar for economic data looks like, for Federal Reserve meetings, earnings season. So I can sort of plant my head of like, okay, this is going to be the week where Walmart and Target and Home Depot and Lowe's all report earnings. let's see what they have to say about retail and minimum wages for their workers, maybe for inventory levels, because people spend all this money on goods and now they're not. So I kind of know in my head, like, what are the things I'm looking for? And you hope that the data delivers for you. And in general, often sometimes you'll see a fight on Twitter, and not that you're responding to a Twitter fight, but you're like, oh, this is actually an important topic that's worth writing about. So you kind of just hope that something comes out of the ether every week you feel like you've got something worthy to say. And so
it's a collection of, obviously monitoring Twitter, calendar of just the process of whatever data is coming out that week, that month. Are there a set number of Substacks, newspapers that you'll comb through first thing in the morning?
I would say the Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal are my two go-tos. They're to me the best two sources for business news. Atlanta stuff I also keep up with. I read the Jolt, of course, and I talk to a lot of
shout out to Greg
reporters. Sort of knowing what's going on there. Obviously, Atlanta politics Georgia politics have been big stories for the past 4 or 5 years now. Fortunately, I feel like we have a little break for the time being. But as those were going on, it was fascinating to watch, the data, the campaigning, all of that, to see, this Kemp Warnock voter that we talked about, and sort of living in that territory, seeing how impactful that was going to be.
Would you ever start your own Substack?
I really like Bloomberg. You never say never because you don't know where media is going to take you. But the thing I like about Bloomberg is that it's based on the data, based on markets, based on the economy.
Well-funded.
And if it matters to markets or the economy, you're allowed to write about it. And it doesn't matter if it's not ideologically advantageous for your side or the other. It's just really, to the extent you can have straight down the middle writing and reporting, Bloomberg, to me, is one of the last games in town these days.
Yeah. Journalism in general has really morphed, right? I mean, how many AJCs are getting delivered, via paper in the mornings?
And not to criticize the AJC, but I feel like they've largely gotten out of the opinion game.
Yeah.
There's Bill Torpy and Patricia Murphy, but there's just not a lot of opinion. And that might be a Cox thing. I can't speak to that. But to me, that's something that I think as a community we really lack. We don't have a lot of voices, especially in our generation, speaking to what's going on in our city and our region and having opinions about it in terms of what really matters to us and is important.
Let's talk about your community that you've curated, whether it's on Twitter so when you put something out, right? And do you have, whether it's public policy wonks or hedge funds up in New York, like how do you navigate the responses? And I mean, are there 100 emails coming to you that are like, this is wrong or this is right? Or
I would say that while I try to write about stuff that a large audience should care about, I really only care about what a couple dozen people think. And like my core people who I talk to all the time, sort of, do the people I'm closest with who know what I'm thinking, where I respect what they're thinking, do they think this is a good piece? And do they think it's like, okay, yeah, that's a good point. And I think if you have a core circle of people who you trust to judge you, then you should just kind of take whatever the broader response is and like, okay, whatever.
Got it. I've been waiting for your piece on the broader piece would be around HQs, building second HQs in cities. And then, for example, the Microsoft on the West Side. I mean, that's something that is, there's a lot of moving parts there.
And that's an interesting one you bring up because in the light of the fact that they've put that on hold, hopefully just a pause. I don't know the exact story for what their plans are. Do we still need big HQs in a world of remote hybrid work? And from a Sunbelt boosterism, Atlanta boosterism standpoint, I hope that Microsoft campus gets built. But I think it does become kind of an open question of do we need new campuses like that? And it's weird because as much as of a fan of remote and hybrid work as I am, I hope the answer is yes. But I think the office market is just in a period of shakeout right now, and it's going to be 2-3 years for us to know, what we should do going forward.
I agree. The office market is in such a shakeout, but here's the thing on that: people don't want to work in their house,
right?
I mean, I went to a coffee shop right down the road the other day, standing room only, waiting for people to leave so they could sit down and work, right? But people just don't want to be in a stuffy, boring office.
And our friend Michael Devani has switch yards. And
Yes.
seems like he's done well with that.
Yes.
So I think
They're opening several, and the one in
They
Decatur is amazing.
Yep.
There's one in Buckhead right here.
One in Chambly coming soon that
Okay.
I'm going to check out.
Nice.
So I think we're just trying to see what this future looks like, because I think, to your point, we're not going to have a world where 50 million people are working out of their house. A lot of people don't have houses where they could even do that if they wanted to. But sort of capitalism hates uncertainty. And until you have a trend with the line moving up for 2 or 3 years, people are hesitant to invest, understandably so.
Right.
And we're just waiting to see. I think 2025, it'll be like, all right, we have a 3 or 4 year history of what's growing, what's working. And at that point, we'll see people consolidate around the winning models.
So we haven't even talked about the second part of what you do, which, yes, you're a columnist at Bloomberg, but you also have, what are you calling it? An investment firm, a hedge fund?
Money management.
Money management. Okay. Peachtree Creek investors.
Right.
Investments. What is it?
That is, I would say that I love the hedge. I love investment management. I love the investment world. I didn't love working for a gigantic hedge fund where just all of the craziness involved in that. And so when I left Cabbage and I was trying to figure out what to do, I said, I know I want to manage money, and why not just put out my shingle and bootstrap it and get friends and family and referrals and manage their money, and very low overhead, just try to help out people I know and invest well for them. And more of a, not trying to build an empire, but it's just sort of probably the same way that people have sole practice law firms, but for money management.
And what's your thesis?
It's really just sort of, I'm trying to invest and save for my retirement, and I figure that most people are as well. So if that's your goal with your money, then I will invest your money the way that I invest my money. And if that works for you, great. And if not, there are lots of other things you can do.
Got it.
So it's very much like this works for me and hopefully my clients. And if not, then you've got plenty of other choices.
And so if you've got a certain AUM amount right now, are you 50% full, 100% full? How do you view the business side of money management?
SEC registration happens at 110 million. That's like much, much higher compliance and paperwork. So that's sort of like a number in my head of, if I get close to that, then either I have to hire somebody to deal with that or really shut it down. Not shut it down, like just actively not raise money.
Stay below the line.
That's still a ways away, but that's kind of the number in my head of, okay, if I get close to there, then I have to decide what I'm going to do.
Yeah. What are you most excited about in the city of Atlanta, let's just say the next 5-10 years? Because the last 15 have been bonkers.
Yep.
Right? New soccer team, new buildings, new everything, right?
I'd say downtown is finally going to happen on some level. And I think it's a question of
here we go.
How much will happen? And I'm optimistic, but I'm also not sure.
So what does that mean? What does downtown will happen?
So Centennial Yards with Brian McGowan.
Yep.
They're going to build stuff. I think they wanted to build a lot more office than I think they'll be able to. So the question is, if the capital demand is just on the residential side, will that be enough? And how many apartments can that area support? Wild Leap Brewing is down there already. Mm-hmm. That's a cool spot if you haven't been down there. South Downtown, there's movement there. That'll be interesting. We know the World Cup is coming in 2026. So that to me is a big marker of where are we going to be in 26 when the World Cup is here. But I think it's just a question of, will we get a few apartment buildings and restaurants here and there and that's it? Or will we get like a full-fledged tens of thousands of residents and, this big boom?
As you collect data, will you go to South Downtown and just walk around and?
Sure. You definitely can see the storefronts being cleaned up, and sort of, you can tell that there's things happening, but it's not yet a place where it's like in our circles, like, oh yeah, downtown's just awesome. We got to go down there and check it out. It's more of like, you're going down there for a Hawks game or a United game or a Falcons game.
Right.
Oh yeah, like there's a brewery here now and Margaritaville's open. Okay, like there's more here than there was 2 or 3 years ago.
So you've got a family here in Atlanta. We always like to ask the question, why Atlanta? What has Atlanta done for you? But I'd like to add one more piece. Why will you stay in Atlanta? And you may not.
I would say that this is the place that I'm going to raise my family. My kids are 6 and 4, so that's another 15 years, call it. And it's a city where certainly right now, and I think for at least the next decade or so, like if it's happening in Atlanta, it matters nationally. I like the fact that San Diego's a nice place to visit, but I feel like San Diego is basically a retirement town where the things that happen there don't matter. Mm-hmm. And I'm fine being contentious because I'm sure San Diego people will be like, oh, it's great here. You don't know it. Nobody cares about what's happening in San Diego. But if it's happening in Atlanta, it matters. There are probably more politicians known from this state, from this region, than almost anywhere else in the country. You can probably go a list of 6 or 10 deep that the average person can name at this point. And just what's happening here, both in terms of people moving here, sort of upward mobility for African Americans, the Black community, that's really encouraging. It's just a really fascinating place to be. Also for my Bloomberg writing, it really is, I think, I'm a better writer because I am experiencing Atlanta than I would be if I were experiencing New York City.
Yes.
When kids are grown, I don't know. That's a long way away.
Yeah.
But to me, Atlanta's given me my family, my church, and really my career at this point.
Conor Sen, thank you so much for being part of the Atlanta Story podcast.
Thanks for having me. This was great.
This podcast is brought to you by Atlanta Ventures. It was co-produced by JC Cadet and John Birdsong. If you are looking to start the next $300 million business in Atlanta, check out the studio at atlantaventures.com and the companies we work with who've done it before. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it at your next coffee meeting or dinner greeting, rate it, and write a benevolent, eloquent review.